Hello and welcome to Justice is a Process podcast. And we are covering our new trial here. This trial kind of popped up. I didn't even know it was coming up. Obviously, we're keeping our eye on the Young Thug trial, but this trial here popped up here on Law and Crime. So I said, you know what? Let's cover it. It looks like an interesting one. And it's one that's going to be ripe with a lot to talk about because it's a self-defense case that stems from a bar fight that occurred up in Boston, Massachusetts last January. A young man stands accused of gunning down, shooting a man 9 times after a confrontation inside a bar. And, if you guessed it, the state investigated and said, well, gee, 9 times seems a little excessive. So because of the amount of times he was shot, he's found himself charged with second-degree murder. And as a result, he is now on trial. So we're going to be covering this trial. We're going to be covering the first day. It looks like this trial is probably expected to last at least through Friday, if not into Monday, as it looks to be a lengthy trial because there's going to be expert testimony regarding use of force, regarding reconstructing the accident. There is videotape. There's a lot of stuff going on in here, a lot to dissect and a lot to break down. And this is going to be one of those cases where it's really going to come down to not that first shot and whether that was warranted, but shots 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Were those warranted? And can he justify that those are reasonable? And, it's going to be interesting. So we're going to jump in here day one, and we are going to listen to day one, break it down. We're going to listen to some of this stuff on double time or time and a half to try to get through it as fast as we can because it is a couple of hours. Now, tomorrow, the upcoming schedule, there will be nothing going on in the morning because they're going to the crime scene. You're going to hear a little bit of that discussed. And a testimony will resume tomorrow afternoon. So, anyways, let's jump in here into the judge's instructions. And give me a moment. All right, and we're back here. So I picked this particular part of the judge's instructions to review because it deals with how the jury is supposed to interpret conflicting circumstantial evidence. And there is going to be some in this case. So I think this is an important instruction to keep in mind, and also to as well as deal with direct evidence. In other words, if you have two witnesses that are dealing with two things that they witnessed, and one tells you a crime was committed, one tells you a crime wasn't committed, he explains how to deal with that. And this is going to be key to the jury in how they interpret the witnesses that come before them in this case. So let's jump in here and take a listen.
So, as I indicated just now, if there's a conflict between witness testimony, you're going to have to resolve that conflict. So, in other words, you're going to have to determine the credibility of witnesses. Simply because a witness takes the witness stand and takes an oath to tell the truth does not mean you have to accept that testimony as true. Use your common sense and your everyday life experience. Again, these are all decisions we make in our day-to-day lives, and you should apply those same skills and judgments you do in your ordinary life to the evidence presented during the course of this trial. So I'll suggest some factors, though, that may be helpful for you to think about as you're considering the credibility of the witnesses who testify. So consider the following factors: a witness's appearance, attitude, and behavior on the stand, and the way the witness testifies. Consider a witness's age, intelligence, and experience. Consider the witness's opportunity and ability to see and hear the things about which the witness is testifying. Consider the accuracy of the witness's memory. Consider whether the witness has any motive for not telling the truth. Consider whether the witness has any interest in the outcome of the case. Consider any bias the witness may have, or any friendship or animosity that witness may have, either for or against any people involved in this case. Consider the consistency or the inconsistency in the witness's testimony. Also consider whether what the witness says appears reasonable or unreasonable. and consider whether what the witness said is either consistent or inconsistent with the testimony of other witnesses or with statements that witness has made at another time. So in deciding which witnesses to believe and how much of their testimony to believe, consider also both the direct and the cross-examination. So if you believe that part of a witness's testimony is false, you can choose to distrust other parts, but again, you're not required to do so. Inconsistencies and contradictions within a witness's testimony or even between witnesses doesn't necessarily mean you should disbelieve a witness. It's possible for two honest people to witness or experience the same event differently. So you should evaluate and consider inconsistencies and contradictions and determine whether they relate to important or unimportant issues. You don't need to believe a witness's testimony, even if that testimony is uncontradicted. You're also not required to accept testimony as true simply because some or even all of the witnesses agree with one another. You can find the testimony of one witness or of a few witnesses more persuasive than the testimony of the larger number. Now, in this case, you're going to also hear testimony from one or more witnesses who testify as an expert witness based on special training, education, skills, or knowledge. And so when a case involves a matter that involves that special knowledge or skill that is not ordinarily possessed by the average person, then an expert is permitted to state his or her opinion for the information and the assistance of the jury. So the opinions that are stated by an expert who testify are going to be based either on particular facts as the expert himself or herself observed, or that the expert learned from others, or that the lawyers who question the expert ask that expert to assume. So you can reject an expert's opinion if you decide that the facts that form the basis of the opinion are different from the facts in the case, or if you determine that the expert's opinion is based on misinformation, or if you determine that the expert lacks qualifications to render a reliable opinion. You can also consider whether or not the expert took advantage of an opportunity to make a thorough investigation before rendering an opinion. And you can reject the opinion if, after careful consideration of all of the evidence in the case, whether it's expert testimony or otherwise, you disagree with that opinion.
So this is important, guys. If you've ever been watching a trial and you've wondered to yourself, why do you hear some of the questioning that why do you hear some of the questioning posed the way it is, in the sense that you might hear a hypothetical where the attorney is saying, if X is true, would this be that? And the reason being is because if they can prove that one of those things are true, then they can discredit the expert. If they can show the expert wasn't thorough, wasn't doing a thorough investigation, or they can in any way prove to the jury that you can't trust this expert, the attorney is then allowed to argue that that expert's testimony should be disregarded. So when you listen to this instruction, this is why jury instructions are extremely important for you to listen to understand the arguments, the questions, and the things that are going on later. So listen to a little bit more of this, and then we'll get into the opening statements.
In other words, expert opinion is given to you to assist you. It is not binding on you. It can be considered by you as any other evidence in the case. Now, as the lawyers question experts, they may ask an expert to assume certain facts to be true. That's called what we call a hypothetical question. And so if it's up to you to determine whether the facts that form the basis of that hypothetical question are in fact proven. So if you determine that the facts that form the basis for the hypothetical have not been proven, then you should disregard any opinion.
So you may hear, if you're a trial watcher, and you may hear a defense attorney come up and say, if X is true and X is true, then would you agree with this? And essentially what the attorney's going to do is they're going to go, okay, we're going to go try to prove that. And that might be the basis for why another expert comes up, maybe a medical examiner or a crime scene processor comes up, and they say, well, did you find this and did you find that? What they've just done is shown fact A is true, fact B is true, and this expert said that, this would then be true. And if that is favorable to their case, they would then legally be allowed to make that argument to the jury to say, this is a fact that's favorable to our case, favorable to our belief of what occurred here. It might go to establish a reasonable doubt to the case, or it might go to establish, hey, this is evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that if it's the state using that. So be listening when you're listening in this case or any other case, and you start to hear hypotheticals. A lot of people tune that out and go, okay, what am I listening here? These are things that couldn't happen. No, what they're asking when they say, if this is true and this would be true, start listening and trying to figure out, okay, where are they going to try to prove that later? Because that's going to give you a little bit of a roadmap for what they're going to do next. Anyways, let's jump back in here.
Opinion offered by the expert based on that hypothetical question. On the other hand, if you find that the facts that have been assumed have been established by the evidence, then that is that the facts are more probably true than not, then you can consider that opinion and give it the weight you think it deserves. So expert testimony, as I said before, as with any other testimony, you can accept all of it, you can reject all of it, or you can accept some of it and reject some of it. Again, that's a decision entirely up to you, the jury.
Alrighty, so we are going to watch now. This is the state's opening statement. So I've got that pulled up here. So we're going to watch this. I'm going to put this on probably like we'll probably do 1.5 times speed to try to speed this up. But this is going to be the case laid out. You're going to hear what the state's version of events are. So pay close attention here, because this is the roadmap for you to watch their case. Because as with many cases, there's going to be witnesses that may come in that might be out of order. They don't. A lot of times, the prosecution doesn't put a chronological case. It's just due to timing, due to the way it's going on, due to availability of witnesses, they can't do that. So it's very important that if you're going to watch a trial and try to understand the trial and try to understand what's going on, that you always start with the opening statement, so you understand exactly what the narrative is, and then what you can try to then do is work backwards. All right, this is the narrative. This witness is being called. What are they adding to that puzzle? What are they showing the jury? And then with the defense is going to, essentially preview for the jury, hey, this is what our role is. This is what we believe you need to be paying attention to. These are the questions we believe are going to come up. And we believe by the end of this case, you're not going to be able to look at this case and say beyond a reasonable doubt that this individual committed this crime. And, it should be pretty basic and pretty, if you're the defense, that is, because what you want to do is obviously you want to allow yourself to create things, allow yourself leeway. Remember, a good defense attorney, as my dad would say, hey, you're not trying to prove anything. So in an opening statement, you don't want to come up and make a big commitment to anything, because you've got nothing to prove. You just explain to the jury what their expectations are. You set expectations. You set expectations for what the defense is required to do. And then it's in a closing argument. Hopefully you exceed those expectations with everything that the questions you've been able to raise, whatever case you might have put on, and you can come to the jury and say, look, this case isn't ready. These are the questions. These are the problems. So anyways, let's get into the state's opening here. Get this set up. Okay.
Defendant, John Delee, was angry. He wanted a fight. He demanded a fight. And he wasn't leaving that night until he got it. He demanded a fight inside the bar, telling Timothy Pouliot, let's go outside. Let's go outside. He demanded a fight as he was leaving the bar, yelling, come fucking fight me. Come fight me. Come fight me, as the bouncers were kicking him out. He demanded a fight out on the street, yelling back at the bar for someone to come outside and fight him. He demanded a fight further up the street when Timmy Pouliot's friend came over to talk, and the defendant struck him in the face, not once, but twice. And he demanded a fight when he squared off with Timmy in the middle of Old Granite Street, surrounded by both of their friends. The defendant was angry at Timmy Pouliot, and angry at Timmy's friends. He was looking to teach Timmy a lesson, but not with his fists. He was looking for a reason to use his gun. And he got exactly what he asked for, exactly what he wanted. As the bars were letting out for the night in Manchester in the early morning hours of January 28th, 2023, as the streets were filling with people leaving to go home, the defendant, John Delee, opened fire on Timmy Pouliot in the middle of Old Granite Street. He shot 9 rounds directly at Timmy, striking him twice in the front, once in the side, and 5 times in the back, gunning him down in a street full of people.
Now, remember, guys, as you're watching this, as you're listening to this, you may be wondering, wow, what case could there be made? 9 shots? Remember, it's about the state of mind. It's about the intent at the moment each and every one of those shots were fired. Now, obviously, the jury can take into account the fact that every single one of those shots, it only has to say, okay, this wasn't reasonable, and the intent transfers from defending myself and believing there's a threat to now I've exceeded that, and now I'm killing this person. So, it's important to understand is the state, of course, is focusing on the fact that there was a fight, and obviously in their eyes, you fire a shot 9 times at somebody, you can't justify that as self-defense. But it's not that simple. The law does allow, if you perceive that there's a threat and believe that you're in a situation that requires you to defend yourself, and we're going to get into a little bit more. I have watched this already, so that's why I'm stopping here, because there's a concept here that if somebody is coming at you and they're trying to take your firearm, then it's as if they have a firearm as well. And if they have specialized training, if they have an ability to disarm you, and that's what the jury's going to have to decide here. I think, this it'll depend on what the instructions are and what the verdict forms say. But this is a situation where I think if there's a lesser included count, I think it's going to be here. I think it's going to be, there's definitely fertile ground to explore the murder, but let's listen further here.
Then turning and walking away. And he did this not out of fear, not out of necessity, but out of anger. This case is about rage, not fear. This case is about retribution, not protection. This case is about murder, not self-defense. Now let's back up for a moment and talk about what led up to the murder of Timmy Pouliot. This all began at the Goat Bar and Grill in Manchester, and you will see this location on your view tomorrow. The road in front of the Goat is called Old Granite Street. And this is an overview of that area with the Goat marked in red. Old Granite Street is a short street in downtown Manchester, and it contains several bars, including the Goat. It's a place where people gather to go out on the weekend. And on the night of Friday, January 27th, 2023, the defendant went to the Goat with his friends, Matthew Soldano and Gage Chandler. Now, this is a floor plan of the interior of the Goat, and you will not be seeing the interior of the Goat during review, but you will be seeing this diagram during trial. So I want to take a moment just to go over it with you. So this red line on the right side of the screen shows you where Old Granite Street is. That's the front of the building. That box shows you the main entrance where patrons come into the bar, get checked in, and then start proceeding in. There's a main bar entrance that you'll be hearing about, or main bar section. There's a dance floor in front of a shaded area, which is the stage that had live music. And there's a ramp area that you will hear people refer to that's right next to the dance floor. Those are the main areas that you'll be hearing about during the trial. There are also several, as you can see, smaller bars and seating areas throughout the Goat. Now, the interior of the Goat contains several surveillance cameras, and you'll be seeing footage from 3 different angles. In red, something called the pool table cam, which shows you the ramp and the dance floor area. In green, there's a camera called the main and sidebar 2, which shows you the main bar and the ramp. And in blue, the main bar window, which shows you the main bar and the exit going back out of the Goat. Now, on the surveillance video, you will see the defendant and his 2 friends, Gage Chandler and Matthew Soldano. And as you can see from these stills that were taken from the surveillance photo, the defendant was wearing a gray knit hat that night and a black North Face sweatshirt. Gage Chandler, over to the left, was wearing a tan zip pullover, and Matthew Soldano was wearing a gray knit hat and a blue long sleeve shirt. Now, the defendant and his friends went to the GOAT on the night of Friday, January 27th, 2023. And while they were there, the defendant's ex-girlfriend, Abby Elliott Orr, arrived with two of her friends, Nicole Bergeron and Olivia Leonardo. Now, the defendant and Abby had dated the summer before, and though they had broken up, he was still obsessed with her. When Abby and her friends arrived at the GOAT, they went to the dance floor, where Timmy Pouliot and his friends began talking with her. You will also see Timmy and his friends in the surveillance video, and again, these are still taken from that footage that you will see during trial. Timmy on the top is the one with the curly blonde hair, and he's wearing a black sweater and a necklace. His friend Trenton Nash is to the left, wearing a white baseball cap and a black jacket, and his friend Michael Mendoza is to the right, wearing a white and black sweater. This is a still from surveillance video showing the dance floor and ramp area that I was talking about at the GOAT. In that yellow box, you can see Timmy with the blonde hair, Trenton Nash, the back of his head with a white baseball cap, and Michael Mendoza. And you can see him starting to talk to Abby and her two friends, Nicole and Olivia. And in the background, in that red box, you can see the defendant watching them. Now, as soon as the defendant saw Timmy talking with his ex-girlfriend, he went over and he started to escalate things. Now, the defendant had never met Timmy before that night, but he made his presence known now. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask how they were doing. He walked up to the group and asked Abby and her friends what they were doing with this scum. Now, Timmy was 5 foot 7 inches and 121 pounds. And Timmy was not armed. The defendant was almost a foot taller and about 200 pounds heavier than Timmy, with a handgun hidden in his waistband. Now, Timmy laughed off the defendant's name calling at first, and then he told Abby and her friends to be safe and to enjoy their night. And he politely left the group. Timmy even spoke to the defendant and shook his hand before going on his way. After a little while, Abby and her friends left the defendant, still over there on the dance floor in that red box, and went up to the bar that you can see in the yellow box area. Timmy and Michael Mendoza were at the bar, and they thought they might still have a shot, so they offered to buy Nicole a drink. And with the defendant still down by the dance floor and safely out of earshot, they talked tough to Abby and her friends. They said that they wanted to fight the defendant. They said that they were pro fighters. And Timmy told the women that he thought he could take the defendant. 5'7", 121 pound Timmy Pouliot told Abby and her friends that he thought he could take the defendant. Now, as soon as Abby and her friends walked back over to where the defendant was, Abby told the defendant that Timmy and his friends had said they wanted to knock him out and that they were pro fighters. You will hear that when Abby told the defendant that Timmy had dared to say he could beat him up, the defendant didn't go to a bouncer for help. He didn't grab his friends and say, "It's time for us to leave." He didn't try to de-escalate the situation in any way because he wasn't scared. He wasn't in fear, but he was angry, really angry. He stared at Timmy, still sitting at the bar, now talking to an acquaintance named Isla Baramovich. The defendant watched him.
Now, it's important to understand the distinction she's making because in self-defense, it's about, do you fear for your life? And with these measurements, do you think this guy who's talking smack, who's wanting to get in a fight, who has a gun, does he fear for his life? Is there any reason whatsoever that he would fear for his life? He has a gun. He's 3 times the size of this guy. This is where it gets to a point where you go, okay, man, it's a little incredible to think that this guy has any fear whatsoever of this other individual. But let's listen on.
And then he confronted him, with the defendant's friend, Gage Chandler, watching behind him in that yellow box. The defendant towered over Timmy's back, and he repeatedly and aggressively challenged Timmy to go outside. Timmy kept saying no, he wouldn't go outside, but the defendant kept challenging him. And Isla will tell you that she knew the defendant was a threat. And you will see in the surveillance footage that she was so intimidated by the defendant's size and aggression that she left to get a bouncer for help. But before she could, the defendant escalated from words to physical violence. He shoved Timmy. He shoved him hard enough that Timmy slid to the left up against another person at the bar. He shoved him hard enough that it caught the attention of Brian Delaney in the blue box there, the bouncer at the other end of the bar. And Brian and other bouncers jumped in and pulled the defendant away from Timmy. Now, this is part of surveillance footage that you'll see during the trial. We're now looking at it from a different angle, and you can see the defendant's back. Here, there's his hat and his friend Gage standing off to the left. Timmy's blocked by the defendant. He's in front of him still at the bar. Now, after the defendant shoved Timmy there, he didn't ask those bouncers that came over for help. He didn't say that he shoved him because he was afraid of Timmy. Instead, when Brian Delaney asked the defendant why he was starting something with such a little kid, the defendant laughed and said that Timmy had called him a bitch. Then the defendant went back down to the ramp near the dance floor to stand with Abby and their friends. Now, Timmy's friends, Michael Mendoza and Trenton Nash, were standing in that same area, and you can see the top of their heads there in that yellow box. You will see that after the defendant assaulted Timmy at the bar, Timmy walked down the ramp and whispered something to Michael. Within seconds, Michael walked over to the defendant and took a swing at him. The defendant grabbed Michael and threw him to the ground, knocking them both into the bar in the process. Now, bouncers from the GOAT immediately jumped in to break up the fight. And along with Manchester police officer Eric Smith, they kicked out Michael Mendoza and they kicked out the defendant, who was bleeding on the left side of his face from the altercation. During the trial, you will see and you'll be able to hear footage of the defendant being kicked out of the GOAT. That was taken by actually a cell phone video from someone in the bar. And you will see the defendant here, as well as Timmy in the background and Abby, and the bouncers around him. This is the edge of Officer Smith, who you'll see in the video. You will see and hear the defendant's emotions. He was in a rage. He was swearing. He was yelling. But he wasn't yelling that he was afraid of Timmy or that he was afraid of Timmy's friends. He wasn't yelling for someone to come help him. He was yelling for someone to come fight him. He was yelling, "Who just punched me in the face? Come fucking fight me. Come fight me. Come fight me." No fear, no terror, just anger. He wanted to finish the fight. He was demanding to finish the fight. You will see surveillance from outside the GOAT after the defendant and Michael Mendoza were kicked out. Now, Michael was the first one to leave the bar with Trenton Nash.
And that is a very important point that she just made, because with him asking for a fight, he is armed and he ends up using that gun. What they're establishing there is intent. And the intent is, I want to engage you in a fight, so I have an excuse to use my gun and create the excuse to kill you. So that's showing an indifference for human life. That's showing a depraved heart. That's showing potentially malice. All of that. And shockingly enough, they're not charging premeditation, but a more ballsy prosecutor might say, hey, you know what? We take a stab and say, this guy's setting this whole thing up. He's trying to bait this guy out of the bar. He's trying to get him to attack him so he can just gun him down. I mean, it's going to be hard to convince 12 people that shooting someone 9 times who's not armed. Now, a lot of stuff happens outside this bar, so we'll watch this. But I mean, that's an important thing to focus on. Now, again, this is an opening statement, so it's not yet evidence. Nothing you're seeing is yet evidence. But it's important to understand what they're going to be trying to prove with the evidence and what you're going to see. So far, I think the state's doing a great job here of making their case that I think they've this guy's not walking out of here with a not guilty unless the only count is his second-degree murder. I think you have a very good shot. The defense has a very good shot at bringing in a lesser offense here. Now, I'm not sure what the punishments for lesser offenses are in Massachusetts. I do know for murder, now we're the 13th juror, we're not supposed to consider penalties, but because we're the 13th juror, we're not official, we can do that, but he faces up to life in prison. So, lots on the line for him. I'm sure that any other lesser offenses will have a prison term that will be far less than life. So that will certainly be a much better outcome for him. But let's jump back in here.
They're highlighted there in that yellow circle. And when they left, they walked across Old Granite Street and got into their car. The white car parked here. Shortly afterwards, the defendant was kicked out. He didn't go straight to his car. He didn't ask for help from a bouncer or from Officer Smith, who was in the GOAT. He didn't quietly walk his separate way. Instead, he stayed on the sidewalk outside the GOAT, surrounded by his friends, with his arms raised, continuing to swear and yell and challenge someone to come fight him. Yelling, "Who punched me? What's up? Who punched me? What's up?" This is a clip of the surveillance footage that you will see at trial capturing those moments as the defendant leaves the GOAT, followed up the street by Abby and her friends as he repeatedly screamed, "Who punched me? What's up?" Still angry, still looking for a fight. Now, Timmy also left the GOAT after the defendant and Michael were kicked out. He wasn't yelling or swearing. He didn't leave angry. He walked out calmly, and he turned left and started walking the opposite direction from the defendant and his friends down Old Granite Street. Now, at this point, Michael Mendoza and Trenton Nash were in their car. Timmy was walking away. This should have been the end of the confrontation. But the defendant wasn't done. He still wanted to fight. Now we're looking at a screenshot from surveillance video from the other direction. So we're looking back down towards the GOAT. Timmy's gone off the screen to this direction. The red box shows you the defendant who's standing there with with Matthew Soldano, with Gage Chandler, with Abby and her friends, all in that group. And Michael Mendoza and Trenton Nash are still in this car. Matt, Gage, Abby, Olivia, Nicole were all trying to calm down the defendant at that point, but they couldn't. He kept getting more and more aggravated. And you will hear, as you could hear on that last surveillance video, how he continued to scream and yell at a street full of people leaving the bars, yelling derogatory words and insults. At this point, Trenton Nash got out of the car and walked across the street and started talking to the defendant and his group of friends. But the defendant didn't want a conversation. He wanted a fight. So he assaulted Trenton, striking him in the head, not once, but twice. You can see Trenton at the beginning of this clip of the video, right here, with the white hat, and he's smoking, and he's walking over towards the defendant and his friend.
Now, before we watch the the clip here. This is the thing that gets me, right? This is where my sympathy meter starts to go down. Now, I understand from a legal perspective, you know, you got to look at it and say, well, wait a minute, what this guy ends up doing at the end of the night. But you got to look at it and say, wait a minute, these guys are in their car. They're leaving. Get in your car and drive off. There's as much on them to decelerate this situation. And it's questionable as to what is this guy doing? He's in his car. He's walking back across. You've got the victim who's up the street watching this all happen. And then they end up going and following this guy and engaging him. And of course, one of the guys gets shot. This is crazy what you're about to hear happen. But to me, this is why I also believe if the defense is smart enough to get a lesser included offense, I don't believe this guy should go away for life for what happened here. I think this whole thing is a mess. I think it's everything that's wrong with including alcohol with a bunch of hothead young dudes who are out and they start getting pissed off at each other. There's women involved, things get amped up. It's also another statement to say it's why clubs and things should be ensuring that nobody has weapons on them and should be doing their due there. There's just no reason to have the gun involved. If the gun's not involved, you know, maybe somebody still is sitting in that defendant's seat, but it's certainly not for murder. But let's watch this clip here.
At this point, when the defendant hit Trenton, Michael Mendoza got out of the car and came over from where he had been sitting in the driver's seat. He pulled out pepper spray and he pointed it at the defendant to get him to back down. The defendant pulled a handgun out of his waistband, dropped it on the sidewalk, picked it back up, and racked it. Abby screamed at the defendant to put the gun away. And at this point, his friends finally managed to push him up the street, away from the goat, and away from Michael and Trenton. Now, Timmy was not there when the defendant struck Trenton. He was still back down the street. But you will see on video footage where he stopped and started looking back up towards the street, toward the confrontation that was being caused by the defendant, before eventually walking back up Old Granite Street. You will also be able to see in this footage the defendant's friend Matt Soldano clearly trying to calm the defendant down as they went up the street, trying to get him to listen and trying to get him to leave. Now, the defendant, Matt, engaged his friends, went up the sidewalk in the direction of that red arrow, past Soho Bistro, which was another bar marked in the orange, which was also letting out at that time. Patrons were leaving at the end of the night. Michael Mendoza and Trenton Nash walked up the street, but turned to their left as marked by that blue path and went into the Bank of America parking lot, which was on the opposite side of the street. Now, at this point, the defendant's path to his car, his transportation home, was clear. Right down that alley to the left-hand side of Soho, back to the Market Basket parking lot where his car was parked. Now, you may hear a claim that this alley didn't seem safe to the defendant and to his friends. Pay close attention to the video surveillance when you watch it at trial, and you will see that the defendant's friend Matt tried to get him to go this way. This was the path straight to their car. There was no one in their way. At this point, there was no one following them. Timmy was still down the street. Michael and Trenton were in the Bank of America parking lot on the other direction. That was the way home. But the defendant didn't want to go home because he wasn't done. He was still angry, and he wanted to finish the fight. He wanted to use his gun. You will see on this video how after starting to follow his friend's Matt's direction and walking towards his car, the defendant turned and came back towards Old Granite Street, ignoring Matt's attempts to stop him. And you will see that Matt yelled at him, he pushed on him, he pointed down that alley trying to get the defendant to disengage, but nothing worked. The defendant was angry and he didn't want to leave. He wanted to fight. So he went past Matt back onto Old Granite Street. This is the video from the defendant in the alley.
And see, this is very important because the fact that he's not leaving, the fact that he has an opportunity to leave, this is where you're losing the fear. This is where you can't say, hey, I have, look, he's pulling the gun out. He's pulling the gun out. I believe he pulled the gun out there. What an idiot. I cannot imagine this guy testified. I mean, if he testifies, I think he'll kill his case, but we'll see what happens. Wow.
The defendant pushed past Matt right to this intersection, marked in red, to square off with Timmy. He didn't go down to the alley to his car so he could leave. He didn't take a right towards the snooze center in downtown Manchester to just leave the area. He didn't walk into Soho, which was open right there in the corner, or back to the Goat, which were full of people. He didn't yell out to security or to anyone else for help. He didn't use his cell phone to call 911. Instead, the defendant chose to walk straight out onto Old Granite Street and square up with Timmy and his friends. And let's be clear, you will see that this was not 1 against 3. Matt Soldano was standing right here next to the defendant. Defense Fred H. Chandler was right off to the corner over here. This is Timmy and Michael Mendoza and Trent Nash. And as they stood there, surrounded by people leaving the bars, as they faced off and argued back and forth in the street, Timmy gave the defendant the excuse he'd been looking for all night. Timmy reached up and punched the defendant in the face. The defendant immediately ripped the gun from his pocket and started pulling the trigger without hesitation. He pulled his handgun out for the final time that night and shot 9 times straight at Timothy Pouliot. And he was so close to Timmy and so focused on pumping those bullets into him that he hit Timmy 8 times. Continuing to shoot, even though Timmy started to turn and fall away to the ground after the first gunshot. The defendant kept shooting after Timmy's back was to him. He kept shooting all the time that Timmy was falling to the ground, his body full of bullets. 2 of those bullets in his front, 1 in his hand, and 5 in his back. 5 shots in Timmy's back, because this wasn't about fear. This wasn't about a threat. This was anger. After the defendant pulled his trigger 9 times, he briefly watched Timmy's body on the ground. Then he turned his back on Timmy, turned his back on Timmy's friends, and simply walked away, leaving Timmy to bleed out and die on the pavement. Now let's be clear, the shooting happened very fast. And it happened that fast because the defendant pulled the trigger that fast. So fast that no one on that street had time to process what he was doing. No one had time to stop him. The most that Timmy could do was turn away. But that didn't stop the defendant. He continued to pull that trigger even after the first shot. When Timmy started falling, the defendant kept shooting in spite of the people in the streets, in spite of the cars in the streets. He opened fire close enough that people ran for cover, close enough that Isla, who had just pulled onto Old Granite Street with a car full of her friends, felt the concussion from the force of the bullets on the roof of her car. Not only did the defendant murder Timmy, he endangered the lives of all those people on the street that night. Now, there will be no question in this case that the defendant pulled out a gun and shot Timothy Pouliot, causing his death. The question for you will be, do you believe his claim that he acted in self-defense? You will receive detailed instructions from the judge on self-defense at the end of this trial. For now, I'm just going to quickly talk to you about 2 requirements for self-defense to keep in mind when you are seeing and hearing the evidence in this case. The defendant is only allowed to use deadly force to defend himself if he actually believed Timmy was about to use deadly force against him, and if that belief was reasonable. You are going to see a lot of evidence that was caught on video. You will be able to see almost all of the events that I have described for you as they played out that night. You will see people's actions. You will see their reactions on their faces and in their body language. You will see people's emotions as the night played out. Watch the defendant.
So I want you to pay attention to that instruction, to that element, to what the law says there, because that's important to understanding what the defense is going to say is the defense. And that is going to be that this defendant believed that there was an imminent danger. He's got punched in the face. He's been pepper sprayed. Now they are aware that he has a gun. So if he were to allow them to get the better of him, if he doesn't shoot them, they're coming to shoot him. I think it's tough. It's a tough argument, because the problem this defendant is going to have at the end of the day is he could have left. Yes, he got punched in the face, but I don't think getting punched in the face by a 120-pound person when you're 300 pounds is really going to make you afraid to the point that you need to pull out a gun. I think the better response was punch the guy in the face. But there's a reason why he wanted him in the street, and this prosecutor is right. I don't know. We're going to see. Obviously, we're going to see what the defense puts on. We're going to see how they handle things. But I think the state has a very, very strong case here. And when you see that video and you see how quick it happened, in the way this guy's pulling that gun out in that alley, I mean, he wants to shoot somebody. And that's the point for me. And we're going back and we're going to play that back here in a minute, because I believe I saw him pull that gun out. And the fact that he's in that alleyway, and if that guy's saying he wants to fight him and he's pulling that gun out on an unarmed person, there's nobody around him at that point. There's no threat or danger. He's just wanting to kill somebody that night. He's just wanting to hurt somebody that night with the gun. That's murder. But let's get back and listen to the rest of this.
Watch his facial expressions. Watch his body language. Listen to his words and his tone of voice. You will see anger. You will see someone looking for a fight. You will see all the other options the defendant had that night other than shooting his gun. What you are not going to see at any time from the defendant is fear. You will not see fear of Timmy. You will not see fear of Timmy's friends. You will not see actual fear at any time throughout the night. And you will not see a reason for fear, because there was none. The defendant's friends were next to him. Timmy and his friends were unarmed. Timmy was almost a foot shorter than the defendant and about 200 pounds lighter than the defendant. A punch from Timothy Pouliot to the defendant was not deadly force. Instead of fear, you will see that the defendant initiated and escalated at every stage of the night. He confronted Timmy when he was talking to Abby on the dance floor. He shoved Timmy when he was sitting at the bar with Isla. When the defendant was kicked out of the bar, he was yelling for someone to come fight him. He punched Trent Nash twice on the street. He was consistently the aggressor, and he had a safe way to leave a confrontation he had started, right down the alley that Matt Soldano was trying to get him to go down. Instead, he turned and he came back, still looking for a fight. The law doesn't allow a person to instigate and escalate and demand a fight and then claim self-defense when someone punches him. When the defendant was arrested by police just after he shot Timmy, he knew he was caught, he knew he was in trouble, and he tried to convince them that he acted in self-defense. And you will hear that he claimed things that the video footage will show you just are not true, like that it was 3 against 1, even though his friends were right there. But those self-serving statements can't erase his behavior up until this point, and they won't erase what you can see for yourself on the video. The other thing to keep in mind as you're hearing the evidence is that a person's not permitted to use excessive force in self-defense, only a reasonable amount of force. The defendant shot at Timothy Pouliot 9 times. 5 of those shots were in his back. And each of those shots was a choice by the defendant to pull the trigger. You will see that every shot after the first one was after Timmy was turning away and falling to the ground. That is not reasonable. That is not proportional. That is excessive by any definition. In a moment, defense counsel will have a chance to speak with you, as I have. They may raise issues with you that are not discussed in the opening, but which will be addressed during trial. I ask you to keep an open mind and wait to hear all of the evidence, see all of the video footage before you make up your mind. The shooting in this case was captured on a bystander's cell phone. This is a still image of the last moments that Timothy Pouliot was alive. Right after he dared to square off with the defendant, dared to punch the defendant. Of all the options available to the defendant that night, he chose the most extreme reaction, he chose the most deadly, and he chose the most permanent.
Dude, these guys are all talking. Oh. Get the fuck back. Hey, get back here, back here.
That is not self-defense. That is rage and retribution and anger. And that is why at the close of this case, we will ask you to find the defendant guilty of endangering all the people on Old Granite Street that night and of murdering Timothy Pouliot.
All right, so I would say, like I said, I think the state has a very strong case. Let's take a look back at that video one more time here. I mean, that's crazy. Here we go.
Dude, these guys are all talking. Oh. Get the fuck back. Hey, get back here, back here.
That's insanity. Now here's the. We're gonna go back here, and this is the important. This to me is just extremely important. Let's watch
you
this.
You will see on this video how after starting to follow his friend's Matt's direction and walking towards his car, the defendant turned and came back towards Old Granite Street, ignoring Matt's attempts to stop him. And you will see that Matt yelled at him, he pushed on him, he pointed down that alley trying to get the defendant to disengage. But nothing worked. The defendant was angry and he didn't want to leave. He wanted to fight. So he went past Matt back onto Old Granite Street. This is the video from the defendant in the.
All right, so let's watch this right here. Tell me, let's watch. I'm gonna show you what I think. He pulls it. He's got his hand here. There's a gun right there. Now, the state hasn't said anything about it. I believe he's got the gun right there. Now, he's kind of putting it back in. Now, watch as he comes across here. He's got it out right here. He's got it out right here. Look. His hand's out right there. He's got it right there. Look, he pulls it out right there. Now, the state has not made a big deal about that. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. That is a huge deal right there. Because that formulates where his head's at. That is it. That is it. He will be convicted because of that image right there. If and I'm sure the state will eventually bring it up. I'm sure it will be accentuated in testimony and their investigators. But if they don't do that, they're missing a huge thing. The
defendant pushed past Matt right to this intersection.
Wow. So, like I said, I think this guy's in a lot of trouble. I think that image right there, to me, seals the deal. If I'm a juror sitting there and I catch that and I see him pulling that gun out, I mean, that's premeditation. That's murder. I mean, I'm shocked this guy's not sitting here. I mean, he wants to shoot these people. And yet that young man comes up and punches him in the face. And well, we're going to hear the defense's side and hear what their explanations are, hear what they intend to prove. So let's jump into that right now. This is a good spot to do that. All right, guys. So we're going to get started with the defense opening. So let's jump in here. I've got it queued up here. And let's run this now.
Knock him out or something along those lines. Michael Mendoza also says he's going to knock John out. They talk about the fact that Timothy is a professional fighter, and they talk about it too.
And I did want to clarify, unfortunately, there was a break, so it picks up in kind of in the middle. I guess he had already kind of done his introduction, and it picks up. So that is the point where the video starts. So anyways, I got it on 2x speed for timing purposes. Anyways, let's jump back in.
Abby, Nicole, and Olivia. They're not just having a little conversation in private talking about this. They are conveying that information to the same girls that they had just been talking to earlier. We're gonna knock this guy out by the end of the night. I'm a professional fighter. And so, of course, the girls go warn John. Why shouldn't they warn him? These guys are out to knock you out. They're out for you. And John goes up to the bar, and we don't have a recording of what was said, but we have the recording of the interaction. And sure, John pushes him. But it's broken up, and John walks away, and that is the end of it, as far as he knows. You'll also see the bartenders don't only talk to John, they talk to Timothy Pouliot. And after they do that, John is minding his own business, talking to the girls, talking to Abby and the other girls. And a few minutes later, you see Michael Mendoza in the video. He's near John, but he's kind of looking the other way. And you see Timothy work his way down the ramp. Remember that ramp that was shown to you during the opening statement? John and the girls are all standing by the end of that ramp on the dance floor. The dance floor is kind of lower than that main bar. And Tim works his way down onto the dance floor and out and whispers something, not sure what, into Michael Mendoza's ear. And Mendoza does kind of a little half moon right up to John and looks away a little bit, and then all of a sudden punches him right in the face. Sucker punch so bad you'll see the blood all over John's face. This is on the right side of his face. Michael Mendoza was not unarmed at that time. You're going to see body cam video of the police officer that's in the bar, and we'll just catch a little glimpse of it. But you're going to see rings on both of Mendoza's hands. He doesn't punch John in the face with bare hands. He's got a big old ring on his ring finger there.
So the defense is trying to make the case. And again, they're trying to make the case that they have rings on their hands. Now, also keep in mind, of course, that they or the defendant believes potentially because of what they told his girlfriend that they are professional fighters. And now he's saying, okay, you have professional fighters, which if that is true, that makes this a weapon, right? This is considered a deadly weapon. You put a ring on it, it's even worse. So this is the crux of the defense here. Now, the question is, did they actually say that? And what are they going to testify to? Meaning the victim's friends. Are they going to corroborate what was said by the ex-girlfriend, who obviously has an interest in helping out her ex because she obviously would not want to see him go away for life? Was that actually said? Did they actually have a belief of that? Did he really believe they were professional fighters? Anyways, let's keep listening.
That explains the giant cut on the front of John's face. And you're going to see the blood coming down his face. You're going to see that in the videos too. John never saw it coming. That's why he's walking out of the bar screaming, "Who punched me? Who punched me?" He just got sucker punched in the face, and his face has been cut open. Is he upset? Absolutely he's upset. Because he's just been darn close to being knocked out after he was already told that they were going to knock him out. And when he gets outside, he's upset. And the girls are trying to calm him down. And they're trying to clean the blood off his face. And he's still upset. And the state's right. It should have ended there. But it didn't. Mendoza is across the street in his car. Fred Nash is in the car. And Mendoza kind of hides, stays in the car. And Nash gets out. And he walks over. And he comes right up to John. He smokes a cigarette and tries to pretend that he's had no idea what happened. As if he had nothing to do with anything that happened in the bar. As if he wasn't there with Timothy Pouliot. As if he wasn't there with Michael Mendoza. And he comes right up to him. And he gets in his face. And even though John Delee, who's just been punched in the face, tells him to get out of here. Even though Abigail Elliott tells him to get out of here, he doesn't. Did John get physical with him at that point? Yes. Should he have? Probably not. But he's not on trial for his interaction with Fred Nash at that point, who, by the way, is just continuing the attack from inside the bar. At that point, Michael Mendoza says, I got to get involved in this. Now's when he comes out of the car, gets up, stands on the snowbank, and holds up a can of pepper spray right into John's face. Right there on the sidewalk. That's when John pulls out the gun. When he is under attack, he pulls out the gun, he drops it, and he picks it back up, and he warns Michael Mendoza away. And it works. Michael Mendoza backs up and backs away. And John turns around, and John and Soldano and Gage Chandler, the three of them start walking up the street, walking away. That's not good enough for Nash and Mendoza. They follow him up the street. And I just want to back up a little bit. Remember when you were told that Tim walks out of the bar nice and calm, he's not screaming and yelling, and he walks out of the bar and he goes left. You'll see what he does on the video. He walks out of the bar and he looks to the right, and that's where Nash and Delee are just about engaging. And he takes a look, and he walks down to the end of the street, and he acts as a lookout. He's watching the end of that street, and he's watching that interaction, and he's deciding when and if he needs to get engaged. So when Nash is confronting Delee, you've got Mendoza in the car across the street watching from one angle, and you've got Timothy Pouliot down at the end of the street watching from the other angle. They are in attack mode, and they will not leave John Delee to go home that night. They follow him up the street. As Mendoza and Nash are following John and his friends up the street, they're yelling back as loud as they can to Timothy Pouliot, he's got a gun, he's got a gun. Mendoza is actively telling Pouliot he's got a gun. What does Pouliot do? He goes right after John, right up the street. Abigail Elliott Orr confronts him. She grabs him. She tries to stop him. She says, don't do it. And what does Timothy Pouliot do? He challenges her to punch him in the face. She declines to do so, and he goes on, gets away from her, and he goes on to confront John Delee, a man that he knows has a gun. And he follows him up. Now, John at that point is facing a long, dark alley to get back to his car. Matthew Soldano is standing at the end of the street, but Nash and Mendoza are standing on the opposite sidewalk, yelling and screaming at him, harassing him. And Timothy Pouliot walks up and leads the charge. You'll see on the video, as soon as Timothy walks past Mendoza and Nash to confront John Delee, Nash and Mendoza themselves begin following Timothy. It's a setup. John Delee's supposed to walk down the dark alley with these people following him? Is that a reasonable place to go? So, unarmed. Right now, we know at the very least that John Delee has been punched in the face with rings. We know that Mendoza has rings on. We know that Mendoza has pepper spray. And the three of them are confronting him. And rather than walking all the way down that dark alley, he turns around to confront the threat that's facing him. And so he does. And you'll see in that video, you see the three people surrounding him. You see Pouliot standing directly almost face to face with John Delee. And you'll see to the right, to John's right, you'll see Mike Mendoza. And to the right of Mike Mendoza, you'll see Trenton Nash. Interesting little detail that the state leaves out at that point. When you see the video of Trenton Nash following Timothy Pouliot to go attack John, he's wearing his coat. He's got a long sleeve black coat on. Michael Mendoza's already in his t-shirt. It was a cold January day in Manchester, New Hampshire. And Michael Mendoza's out there in a t-shirt. Why? Because he's about to get in a fight. Nash has had his coat on. The funny thing about the cell phone footage is part of it looks to the right and part of it looks to the left. So the right looks down the alley and the left looks down over Granite Street. And the shooting happens right in the middle. And the only footage we have of the shooting itself is that cell phone video. But between the time that Nash crosses into that blind spot, we'll call it, and the time that cell phone video starts, his coat is on. Why is his coat off in January in New Hampshire on a cold winter night if he is not part of this fight? So he's got his coat off, right? And that's not the only thing he does. He states that it's not 3-on-1. John's got all his friends there. Well, first of all, Gage Chandler, you don't see him in that video because he is up on the sidewalk on the other side of a snowbank and on another side of the rail in front of the Soho Pizza. He's not out there in the street getting involved in this. And Matthew Soldano is confronted by Trenton Nash, who's already thrown his top coat off. Hey, do you have a gun? He checks him. He checks him. And how does Matthew Soldano react to that? He puts his hands up and he starts walking away. He's behind John Delee, he's walking away, and he's facing away. And that's the moment when it is truly 3-on-1 with two other people who all mean John Delee harm. That's when, for the second time in the same evening, John Delee gets punched in the face by somebody that he has been told is a professional fighter. They've told him they're going to knock him out. They meant it. They've shown they mean it. And if you're standing on that street there with a gun in your hand, knowing that these people know you have a gun and are ready to punch you in the face anyways, ready to surround you, ready to confront you, ready to punch you in the face, they do. Second time, he's been punched directly in the head. How does he know that they don't mean to get his gun? How does he know that they don't mean to kill him? How does he know that they don't mean to kill him with his own gun? The judge is going to talk to you about the definition of deadly force. So take the judge's definition and not mine. But deadly force in New Hampshire means an assault which the actor commits with the purpose of causing or which he knows to create a substantial risk of causing death or serious bodily injury. What do you think? What will you think that Timothy Pouliot meant to do to John Delee at that time? What will you think that Trenton Nash meant to do to John Delee at that time? What will you think that Michael Mendoza meant to do to John Delee at that time? If not, death or serious bodily injury. So the moment he gets punched in the face, again for the second time, he immediately pulls out his gun and fires. The state makes a lot about the fact that some of the bullets went into Timothy Pouliot's back. I want to make absolutely clear. Timothy Pouliot did not run away. He didn't retreat from this encounter. At the time that the trigger is first pulled, he's facing John Delee. He falls backwards and he lands backwards facing John Delee. He might have twisted on his way down, but he wasn't retreating from that encounter. He never did. Those 9 shots happened in a split second. The state would make you think John Delee thought between each and every time he pulled that trigger, oh, have I neutralized the threat yet? Nope. Oh, have I neutralized the threat yet? That's not the speed that any of this happens. He's facing a serious threat to his life and his well-being, and he pulls the trigger fast. The moment the threat is neutralized, you'll see Mendoza and Nash go running. Timothy Pouliot's no longer a threat, and he walks away. Now, lest you think that John Delee can't recognize the difference between a real threat to his life and his safety and a fake threat to his life and safety, you're going to see when the police officers arrive. Those police officers arrive, they pull their guns on him. And he knows that those police officers don't mean him harm, because the first thing he does is take the gun and put it down on the ground. He puts the gun down on the ground and away from him so quickly that the police officers, both police officers that are involved in detaining him at that point, both of them have to ask what happened to the gun, even though he did it right in front of them. Put your gun down there, yelling at him, and he's pointing. You can see him point at the gun on the ground. So even police officers that are pointing guns at him, he knows that they're not a threat. He doesn't try to use any kind of force against them. He puts the gun down on the ground, he gets down on his knees, he puts his arms out, and says, it was self-defense, it was 3-on-1, they attacked me. Immediately, that's what he's telling the police. If you go back and look at all the evidence in this case, at the end of this case, what you're gonna have the ability to do, you're going to see that everything that John Delee told the police right then and there was correct. Timothy Pouliot, Michael Mendoza, and Trenton Nash planned an attack on him. They used tactical maneuvers to attack him. They threatened him. They pursued him. They gave him no out. Unfortunately, Timothy Pouliot lost his life as a result of it. And again, the state's right. It should have ended many times before then. But John Delee is not guilty of these crimes that he's charged with. And at the end of the case, we'll come back and ask you again to find him not guilty. Thank you.
All right, guys. So that's the opening statements. There are 2 witnesses that we're going to check out today. There were 2 witnesses that came on. I have not watched them. I only previewed the opening statements because I wanted to kind of have an idea. But we're going to watch them. And then, like I mentioned, tomorrow they're going to be going, the jury's going to be going to the scene. I don't think we're going to get to see any of that. But one of the things that jumped out at me as I was thinking back at the openings, and again, it's the second time I watched them, one of the things I think I missed, that scene in the alleyway really sticks with me as to me being something that demonstrates that this guy's state of mind is not one of fear, right? But one of the things I think the defense is going to make a big deal about, and we'll see what the instructions say about this and what the ultimate final arguments are on this point. But one of the things that I forgot about is if John Delee believed that these individuals were truly professional fighters and they held themselves out to be professional fighters, technically speaking, then these things right here, these 2 fists, if they're trained on how to use them, it's considered to be as deadly a weapon as a gun or a knife or something like that. So if that's the case, being the fact that not only do you have trained hands, but you've got rings on the hands, he's already been attacked. These guys are not going away. And again, it's going to be all about what's being seen off camera. And if they were truly triangulating, and then of course the defense attorney makes the point about the fact that you see a jacket on him and then you don't see a jacket, which indicates he's ready to go into fighting. And you got 3-on-1, and these are truly professional fighters. I don't know if they are or not. I assume we're going to hear evidence on that. But if they truly were, man. But if he thinks they are, if that's truly what was said, and that can be proven that that's what was said, again, at a very minimum, you could eliminate the idea that murder exists, but you could also cross the finish line on a self-defense. I think it's going to be tough because I think 9 shots, that's a tough sell. But, we'll see what the defense does. But if you could get an expert or somebody in there to explain how someone who's in fear of their life just pulls the trigger and it just creates a situation where it's just pop, 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 and next thing you know, he's pulled off 9 shots. He intended to do 1, but he ended up doing 9 because of the adrenaline and the fear in the situation. Hey, you know what? You might be able to get at least a hung jury out of this. But it's going to be an interesting case. But let's jump into the witnesses, and we're going to jump on that here. Give me 1 moment. All right, so let's check this out, guys. We're going to normal for right now.
It will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God. Mr. Honor.
Officer Fazio, if you could, just for the record, you might have to lean that microphone forward just a little bit. There you go. Can you just state and spell your last name for the record?
It's going to be Officer Fazio, Fazio.
Okay. And where do you work, Officer Fazio?
Manchester Police Department.
And how long have you worked there?
3 years, sir.
And where did you work before that?
No, sir.
This your first law enforcement job?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And what's your current assignment at
We're going to
Manchester?
put this at 2 times speed, guys.
And is that what we see kind of drive around the city in a uniform capacity in a marked cruiser?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And are you a full-time certified police officer?
Yes, sir.
All right. Was your role in January of this year also patrol?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I want to take you back to a specific time in January. I want to take you to January 28th in the early morning hours. Were you working at that time?
Yes, I was, sir.
What shift were you working?
I was working the midnight shift.
And what was your area of responsibility that night? Do you have sectors, patrols, or how does that work?
Yeah, so we have different sectors. That night I was 1-6. Kind of just like an extra car floating unit where we have delivery kind of anywhere in the city.
And at about 12:47 a.m. that morning, were you dispatched to a call?
Yes, sir.
What type of call were you dispatched to?
It was a gunshot heard call.
And where was that?
It was at a 50 Old Grand Street.
And did you witness the shooting?
No, sir.
Did you witness any of the events that happened before the shooting?
No, I did not, sir.
Before we talk about your response, I want to talk a little bit about that area in general. So I'm going to show you State's Exhibit 1. And do you recognize this?
Yes, I do, sir.
What is depicted in this satellite image? Can you just help orient us and explain what we're looking at?
Yep, so this is basically the downtown area of Manchester, running north to south, the biggest street. That's going to be Elm Street.
If you want to step down, you're on the witness steps down.
Okay, sorry. Hold on.
Step down right here.
Good. All right. So,
Yeah, I think
so like I said, Elm Street's going to be running north to south. We have the Snow Arena here, Lake Ave, and Grand Street are going to be running east to west. We got Market Basket here, and then Old Granite Street is going to be this little tiny street running right through there.
Okay.
So it sounds like this guy was the first responder.
Point out specific things. So you had mentioned the Snow Arena, you had mentioned Market Basket. Are those accurately, reasonably accurately reflected in this diagram? Yes, sir. Where those locations are. Okay. So if we just zoom in a little bit, I'm going to take you to State's Exhibit 2. Can you just help
So
describe
he's
what we have
just, I guess, laying the foundation for
Bank of America, we've got 2 of our bars right here, which is the Soho Bistro and the Go.
here? And
what
that's
they're
Granite
gonna
Street,
see
just on the
tomorrow.
Right, that's Granite Street. That runs down kind of between Elm and 293. Exactly, sir. Okay. All right. If you want to go back, go ahead and go back to the stand for me. All right, so when you responded that night, you said you were running uniform capacity. Do you have body-worn cameras?
Yes, I do, sir.
And where are those on your uniform?
I have mine right here. It's usually right in the center of our chest.
And so it's looking forward?
Yes, sir.
And how does it work?
As soon as you activate it by using your little device on our wrist or wherever the other officers put it, it begins recording at that time as soon as you hit it.
And did you activate it this night when you responded?
Yes, I did, sir.
When you got to that Soho Bistro right at that corner that you pointed out, can you describe for us what you saw on your arrival?
When I got out of the car, I saw that there was a large group of people in the middle of the street, which would be Old Grand Street, and I saw a male laying on his back in the middle of that group on the pavement.
And was that man, you said lying, was he talking, moving, making any statements?
No, sir, he's unresponsive.
And what did you immediately do at that point?
At that time, I started doing a medical assessment or a BATH assessment.
What is BATH?
So-
BATH is BATH?
Yes, sir.
Okay, what does that stand for?
So it's an acronym. So it stands for, when you're going to do a medical assessment, it's just things that you're kind of looking over. So B is bleeding, A is airway, T is tension in the thorax, and then H is just hypothermia.
Okay, and those are the things you're trained to look for when you first respond to something like
Correct,
that?
sir.
Okay. Are you an emergency medical provider?
No, sir.
Where did you receive this type of training?
So every year at the Manchester Police Department, we go through a course called tactical medical training. And that's for the last 3 years, that's what I've been doing.
Did you try to render any aid to the person who was lying on the ground?
Yes, I did, sir.
I'm going to show you a still image. This is that image that was discussed earlier. I'm going to show you State's Exhibit 3. This is a still image. Do you recognize where this is from?
Yes, I do, sir.
And where is this image taken from?
This is going from my body camera.
Does this accurately reflect where the person was when you found them in relation to Soho?
Yes, it is, sir.
Okay. Whose hands do we see there? We see some with gloves. Whose hands are the ones without gloves?
Those are mine, sir.
Okay. Any reason no gloves?
Just doing the response. I didn't have time to put any on.
Okay. And it looks like there's some sort of plastic or something on the left shoulder there. Is that part of the treatment you were providing?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Can you just talk briefly, just explain to us what did you try to do to render aid to this person?
So first, I found that there was multiple gunshot wounds. One was being like up on his left shoulder area where you saw that plastic piece, and then there was another one in his armpit that's shown in that picture right there. At that point, because of the location of the wound, I put a chest seal on the one that was located like near his armpit region on the shoulder, and then the armpit one, I began packing with combat gauze.
Okay. And was that an attempt to stop bleeding?
Yes, sir.
Did you perform or did anyone that was there perform CPR?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And did emergency medical responders arrive at some point?
They did.
Okay. And did they take over treatment?
Yes, they did.
At any point during your treatment, did you see any responsiveness or signs of life from the person who you found lying down?
No, sir.
Did you ever see the person lying on the ground ever conscious again?
No, sir.
What happened after fire and EMS treated Timmy for a few minutes?
They declared him 10-2, which in our terms is deceased.
And what was your role after Timmy, after that person was pronounced dead?
After that, I didn't have much role. I just basically cleaned myself off and provided scene security at that point.
Did you have any further involvement with investigating what happened that night?
No, sir.
Just 1 second. When you were doing your assessment of this person lying on the ground, did you see any weapons, knives, guns, bats, anything on that person?
No, sir.
I have no further questions. That's me.
Thanks, sir.
All right, so that was more of a what I would call just laying the foundation for setting the scene. This is what he saw. He was the first responder, and he also points out the fact that he did not see any weapons on the defendant or on the victim. I guess he didn't really interact much with the defendant. I'm sure we're going to hear about that here from someone, I'm sure, at some point. And he just kind of sets the scene. It's a shame we couldn't see the body cam. I assume that was something that they just don't want us to see because it's going to show the condition of the victim there. But yeah, I mean, these are kind of inconsequential witnesses. This is the stuff that you see, but you want to look and see ask yourself after every witness, if you're watching a trial, try to understand the purpose of that witness. And if they get off the stand and they've done a good job, you'll be able to see it. So for me, the point of this witness, the main point, was to establish that there was no weapon anywhere in the vicinity of the victim. That was the main point. And he also sets the scene. Let's check out the next witness. And then this is the final witness of the day. Looks like this one's going to take a little while. So we got, if we go double time, it'll probably take about 20 some minutes. So let's get this started.
First scene is the research. Can you swear testimony about the truth, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. There's water up there too if you need it. And there's a microphone that's kind of in front of you, so if I can't hear you, I'll ask you to speak up, but just feel like that's over. Thank you. Could you please state your name and spell your last name for the record?
Yes, my name is Jill Terrio, last name spelled T as in Tom, Herriault.
And where do you work, Mr.
Currently, I'm employed with the New Hampshire State Police Forensic Lab in Concord, New Hampshire.
And what's your position there?
There, I am a criminalist too, in the section of the Pattern Evidence Unit, and more specifically, I am a firearm.
So they're getting right into the criminalist. And this is exactly why, like I said, you've got to have that map, right? And because you're not going to get orders, you'd think the next person they'd be putting on here might be a police officer that had interactions with the defendant. Kind of tell that story in a chronological order. They're not going to do that. So they're going to put the criminalist on, who's going to start talking about the breakdown of the scene. I'm assuming talking about weapons at the scene, talking about what we're seeing. But interesting decision here to put the criminalist on. Probably has to do with availability, I would imagine. So she was available, so they put her on. So let's keep watching.
And can you explain what the pattern evidence unit is?
Excuse me. Yes, so the forensic laboratory is composed of a number of different forensic testing areas, and the Pattern Evidence Unit, which is the unit that I work in, is made up of latent print and fingerprint examiners, footwear and tire track examiners, as well as myself that examines firearms and toolbox.
How long have you worked for the New Hampshire State Forensic Lab?
It'll be 4 years in December.
And do you have educational background that relates to what you do for work?
I do, yes. In 2001, I received my Bachelor of Science degree from Rutgers University in New Jersey. And in 2004, I began on-the-job training through my first job in the forensics field at the Miami-Dade Police Department Crime Laboratory Bureau.
Can you just explain the experience that you had with Miami and what prior forensic experience you had leading up to the lab?
Yes, so in 2004 is when I was hired on by the Miami-Dade Police Department Crime Lab. And in that capacity, I began a 2-year in-house training program that was conducted under the supervision of a senior firearms examiner. And so that 2-year training program included learning about firearms and how they operate and how all the internal parts and pieces work together to make a gun work, how ammunition functions inside of a firearm and how that's evolved over the centuries, and most importantly, learning how to use particular pieces of forensic equipment to examine bullets and cartridge cases that are collected from crime scenes in order to determine whether or not they were fired from a particular gun. So that was my in-house training. In 2004, I was also selected by the ATF, which is the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, to participate in their 1-year National Firearms Examiner Training Academy. And that training, in conjunction with my in-house training, followed similar steps in that I learned about how firearms operate, how different firearms such as rifles and shotguns and handguns work, how to examine bullets and cartridge cases using a comparison microscope to determine whether or not they were fired from a particular gun, as well as some other forensic testing duties that are typical of a firearms examiner. My instructors at the ATF program were firearms examiners from all across the country. So when I was finished with the in-house and the ATF training, I spent 10 years down at the Miami lab doing firearms examination. And then in 2014 is when I moved a little further north. I was employed by the state of Connecticut Forensic Laboratory, and there I was the supervisor of the firearms toolwork unit.
Do you hold these certifications now that are specific to your field?
Yes, I do. Through the professional organization that I belong to, which is called the Association of Firearm and Toolmark Examiners, they offer a certification program that a person or an examiner is eligible to sit for once they've attained 5 years, so 2 years of training and 3 years of doing casework. So when I was eligible to sit for that, I sat for the written test, and upon successful completion of that, I was able to take a practical exercise where I received actual bullets and cartridge cases to determine what possible gun they were fired from. And then once I was completed that, I have to maintain a certain number of continuing education credits, and those are attained by attending training conferences, giving presentations at those conferences, teaching opportunities, and things like that. And that's in a 5-year cycle, and I've held that certification since 2009.
So about how many firearm examinations would you say you conducted in your career?
Oh gosh, going back to 2004, it would probably be in the thousands, I would say, between Miami, Connecticut, and up here in New Hampshire.
Have you testified in court before regarding firearm examinations?
Yes, I have.
About how many times?
On the state and federal and county levels in Florida, Connecticut, and New Hampshire, it's been just over 100 times.
Have you previously been qualified as an expert in the area of firearms examinations?
Yes, I have.
Again, feel free to. You have water.
Yes, I do. Thank you.
We're all doing it. So, Your Honor, I would ask at this time that the court recognizes Terry to be qualified as an expert under Rule 702 in the area of firearms.
Give me a opinion.
So just taking a moment now to discuss some of the terminology that you use in your work. Do you have a model that helps you explain the process that you use when you're examining?
Yes, I do.
What is this a model of?
This is a plastic model of a live round of ammunition and its component parts. It's all plastic. There's no live anything associated with it.
Would you mind taking that out and showing that to us? if you're comfortable where you are, I'll just ask if you can hold it up high enough that we can just kind of see it over some of the stuff that's in front of you.
Sure, yes. Yes.
But can you use this and explain to us what a round of ammunition is composed of?
Sure. So what I have here again is a plastic model of what is a live round of ammunition. Some people might know it just as a bullet, but it's actually made up of 4 different component parts. So this outer light tan color area is called the cartridge case or the casing, and what's held inside of that is gunpowder. Now, if you look at the back or the bottom of the cartridge case, there's a small circular area called the primer. The primer is a shock-sensitive material, so when this live round of ammunition is in a firearm, when the trigger is pulled and the firing pin moves forward to strike this primer area, that causes a small detonation, and that ignites the gunpowder that's housed within this cartridge case. So when that gunpowder starts to burn, a whole lot of heat energy is built up. So that will then send the bullet, which is actually seated in the mouth or the opening of this cartridge case, all that heat and energy sends this bullet down the barrel of the firearm and onto the target. And depending on what type of firearm it is that you're firing, this cartridge case that's now empty will either be extracted and ejected from the gun and land on the ground, or it can remain inside of the gun until the person operating the gun manually removes it from the cylinder of the gun.
So you talked about the fact that a cartridge case, different things happen depending on what kind of weapon you're talking about. Can you explain what happens with a semi-automatic firearm?
Yes, but first let me explain a little bit about what a semi-automatic firearm is. Typically it's a handgun, or it can be a long gun like a rifle too. But what semi-automatic means is that with each pull of the trigger, the gun will fire. And that's a little bit different from, say, the type of firearm that like John Wayne, for example, would walk around with. He had what's called a revolver. So that's a little bit of a different way that the gun operates, where these cartridges are held in a metal piece called a cylinder. And once the person is finished shooting, these empty cartridge cases remain inside. But in a semi-automatic firearm, when the gun is fired, these empty cartridge cases are extracted and ejected, and they are sent out of the firearm. And you see a lot of those types of firearms in like movies and TV and that sort of thing.
So every time the trigger is pulled with a semi-automatic firearm, the gun fires a bullet and then ejects the empty casing in some direction.
Yes.
Not necessarily on the side, but
Yes, it will. Each time the gun is fired, the empty cartridge case will be extracted and ejected, and typically that comes out of the gun on the top side of it, and it's ejected to the right and generally to the rear.
and then the gun puts another cartridge into the chamber so it's ready to fire again without the person having to do that.
That's correct.
Can you explain just what the difference is between the firing of a semi-automatic weapon and an automatic weapon, or what people may think of as like a machine gun? Just explain the distinction for us.
Sure. So a typical semi-automatic firearm is one where every time the person pulls the trigger, the gun will fire. There's a set of components on the inside that sort of resets every time when you pull the trigger and then when you let go. So every time you pull the trigger rearward, the gun fires.
All right, guys. So I think, again, we'll see if this changes once we get to the end of this. But I think the purpose of this witness is to talk about how the shots were fired. In other words, the defense is going to say he just started pulling the trigger, right? He's in fear, and he doesn't intend to pull it 9 times, but it just goes off 9 times. I think she's setting up the fact that the way these weapons work, you would know, even though it sounds on tape, pop, 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 that it's like boom, 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 boom. She's establishing that intent. So say the defense wins the day. It says, okay, he was in fear for his life, so he fires once. That would be reasonable. Was 2 reasonable? Was 3 reasonable? Was 4 reasonable? Was 5 reasonable? Yeah. And if the jury can say, no, it wasn't, then the jury comes back guilty. So I think I'm understanding now why this witness was called first, because I think this could be, they could be nailing the nail in the coffin right now. I mean, if this is done right, let's keep going. Let's keep watching. And this will be important information, I think, to have in front of that jury when they're walking out to that crime scene to see how they feel about how everything looked. So anyways, let's keep listening.
The cartridge case is extracted, the bullet goes down the barrel, and that whole system sort of resets, and you can then pull the trigger again to fire the gun again. Now, that's a little bit different from what you just mentioned about a fully automatic firearm, in which that process of firing the gun, extracting the cartridge case, the bullet traveling down the barrel, where that's repeated many times with the person holding the trigger backward, like holding it and keeping it to the rear, where as long as there's ammunition in the gun will continue to fire until either it runs out of ammunition or if the person lets go of the trigger with their finger.
So if you have a semi-automatic firearm, is it fair to say that, or just to be clear, does every shot from that firearm require a separate squeeze of the trigger?
It would, yes.
So I'd like to ask you about the testing that you did in connection with this particular case.
Yes.
Which items were you asked to examine?
There was a Glock semi-automatic pistol that was submitted to the laboratory for this case, as well as a magazine and live ammunition.
And as part of the examination that you did you prepare a report outlining your conclusions with regard to these items?
Yes, I did.
Did you also take photos of the firearm that you examined?
I did, yes.
What I'd like to do is show you State's Exhibit 54. What are we looking at in this photo?
So this is a photograph of the firearm that I examined. When I opened the box, I typically will take a photograph of the firearm of how I received it. So inside of this gun box is the Glock pistol. There's an orange safety strap that's going through the action of the firearm, the one that's sort of running up and down along the grip there. There's 2 orange, zip ties that are strapping it to the package, and on the front of the firearm, there's also a flashlight that's mounted on the rails.
And when you received it, is this how it comes packaged to you? Is there like a protocol for how the lab takes in the firearm?
Typically, yes, this is standard submission condition for firearms that come to the laboratory.
So could you describe this particular pistol and how it works?
Yeah, so this is a Glock semi-automatic pistol. Glock is a brand of firearm. They're from Austria that makes all different types of models of pistol. So this is a semi-automatic, and as I mentioned, on the front end of the firearm, there's sort of a laser and a flashlight combination that's mounted there. That's the black object that's right above the ruler there. But again, it's a semi-automatic. In a separate package, there was the magazine, or sometimes what people will call a clip, but that's the device that holds the live rounds of the ammunition. So the way that this firearm operates is that if you have a magazine, and it's a sort of a spring-loaded little box container that you put the live rounds of ammunition in, that would then be inserted into the grip or the handle of the firearm. That area right there is hollow so that it fits a magazine in there. So to fire this weapon, once you have put the magazine in the grip or the handle of the firearm, the top portion of the firearm called the slide, which is, it has kind of ridges on the left side of it right here, you would have to pull that backwards. It's under spring tension, so when you pull it backwards and then let it go, it will spring into place. And as that slide moves forward, it's going to take a round of ammunition from the magazine and then place it into what's called the chamber of the firearm. And at that point, this firearm would be then ready to fire.
So what is required of a user? You explained to us what's required of a user to shoot a bullet from this particular pistol. I should say, you've explained to us how the bullet is in place for the machine. What is then required at that point for the user to actually shoot?
So once that slide has been retracted and let to go forward, which will then chamber a live round of ammunition, at that point, this type of pistol is ready to be fired. So then using your finger, you would then place your finger on the trigger, which in the middle of the firearm there, it's that sort of triangular shape. You would place your finger on there and pull that backwards. In this particular type of firearm, pulling the trigger deactivates the safety features that are in the firearm. There's one that you can see on the outside here, which I can explain in just a moment. But pulling the trigger in a Glock pistol will then deactivate the safety features and the gun can be fired.
Can you explain to us what you mean by the safety features?
Yes. So actually, may I?
Yeah,
Am I allowed to step down and point?
If you want to come down to the side of the. Okay, so as I mentioned, this particular pistol has. Just gonna move the microphone so we can get you on recording. So this pistol has what's called one of the safety features is called a trigger safety. So if we're looking right here, this piece right here is the trigger, and this little piece that juts out, sort of sticking out from it, is called the trigger safety. And the only way that can be deactivated is by placing your finger on that trigger and the trigger safety, and there we go, and pulling that backwards. When you pull the trigger, that allows this little piece right here that's normally in contact with the frame of the gun that will keep the trigger from moving. Once you press that whole set, the trigger and the safety, that will then deactivate that safety. But otherwise, if the firearm is just sitting, no one's touching it, no one's handling it, when it's at rest, this little trigger safety will keep the whole trigger from moving backwards. Does that also mean that if you hit the trigger to the side, for example, or jostled it in some way, would it fire at that point?
No, it would not. It protects it protects the gun from firing unless a person's finger is actually fully squarely on that trigger, being able to pull it backwards. So if your finger were to slip off, or if you were to drop it or anything like that, that trigger safety will keep that trigger from moving rearward.
And so what's required to shoot multiple bullets from this particular gun if you were to shoot in a row?
So as I mentioned just before, once the magazine is inserted and the slide has been retracted and a round has been placed in the chamber, you would just need to pull the trigger to fire. What happens next, all of this happens in a very, very quick fashion, in like an instant. There's a part of the firearm that's housed in this area of the slide called the firing pin, and pulling the trigger allows that firing pin to move forward and strike the primer of a cartridge. That primer was that small shock-sensitive material on the round of ammunition. Once that occurs, the firearm will go off, all that energy and heat will send the bullet down the barrel of the firearm, and then all that energy that was created pushes backwards on the slide and overcomes that spring pressure. That backward movement of the slide will then extract and eject the cartridge case that's now empty and eject it onto the ground. And then as the slide moves forward again, if there's ammunition in the magazine, it'll take the next round of ammunition and put it into the chamber of the gun. All of the internal parts have been reset, and you can pull the trigger again, and then the gun would fire again. And that process would be repeated until you either run out of ammunition or you stop pulling the trigger.
So just to be clear, the gun's resetting itself essentially after you use it, but you still need to actively pull the trigger to shoot another bullet?
That's correct, yes.
Is there anything else that we should know about before I ask you to sit down? Is there anything else that you wanted to indicate to us about the outside of the weapon?
No, that's it. Just the slide. This is the grip area right here that's hollow.
So this is very important, guys. I mean, to understand this testimony, this is extremely important. What she's just described here is, number one, it's not an automatic weapon. So just merely pulling the trigger once would not cause the weapon to fire 9 times. It's going to require you to continuously pull the trigger. And you're going to know what you're doing the way she's describing it, because you're going to be required to keep doing it. Now, that doesn't mean that if this guy's afraid and he's just like I said, just going wild, pulling the trigger. But I mean, this thing's got a laser on it. I mean, wow. And the fact that he hits him 9 times. Again, we'll see what the defense does with this. We'll see what they do on cross, if we get to see the cross today. And we'll see how this ends up playing out.
Where the magazine goes, the source of ammunition, and right here is the trigger.
You mentioned a flashlight also?
This device right here that's mounted on the front end of the firearm, it's a combination of a laser pointer and a flashlight that was mounted on there.
And so this specific firearm, does it have any sort of lever or button that you switch to turn on or off, like sometimes for a safety on the external part of the weapon?
No, excuse me. This doesn't have any external safeties besides that trigger safety that we just talked about. All of the other safety features are housed inside of the firearm.
Thank you. You can take a seat here. So what sort of examination did you perform with regard to this particular weapon in the magazine?
So this firearm underwent what I would call an operability or a function test. When the firearm was delivered to the laboratory and it was ready to be worked, essentially I have a worksheet that I fill out that collects all of the information about the gun. So some of the basic things like the make, model, serial number, it would be how it operates, what are those safety features that are present on this firearm, its overall condition. I'll look down the barrel to count the number of lanes and grooves, which is rifling, that's inside of the gun barrel. I will do what's called a trigger pull test to see how many pounds of pressure it takes to pull the trigger of the firearm. I will conduct what's called a jar off test to determine whether or not it's susceptible to an unintentional discharge from it being dropped or something striking it. Once I've gone through all of that, the final step in the testing phase would be then to actually test fire it myself. And in that process, I'll select ammunition from the laboratory supply. The ammunition gets marked with the case number, T1, T2 as in test number 1, 2, 3, however many I fire. And once I've done that, there's a special room at the laboratory that houses basically a water tank, a big tank of water that a firearms examiner can test fire guns in. And that allows me to collect bullets from that firearm and collect the cartridge cases as well for any comparisons that may need to be done.
So, and you engaged in the second testing of this particular weapon?
I did, yes.
What conclusions did you reach about the functionality of this pistol?
It was examined, it was test fired, and I found it to function normally, and I found that it was not susceptible to any type of accidental discharge due to jar off.
And did you reach any conclusions about the magazine?
The magazine that was submitted along with this, it was capable of holding 17 cartridges, and it's compatible with this pistol, and it was also used for test firing.
And just one more detail I wanted to ask you about, were there certain exhibit numbers that these items came to you with?
Yes, the firearm, the submission number for that, or the exhibit number was BML, as in Bob, Mary, Larry 1, and then the package with the magazine and the live ammunition was BML1B.
Who assigns those letters to?
Typically, those indications are given by typically the crime scene personnel. Let's see. Yes, so typically the people that collect the items from the crime scene, I believe that's usually their initials of the person that collected it.
Finish in a moment. Just one more question, sir. Just to be clear, when you squeeze the trigger of this gun, how quickly does it go off?
Usually, well, there's a little bit of movement when you pull the trigger backwards, but pretty much as soon as you pull it backwards, you'll feel tension in there. Once that tension is sort of overcome by you pulling the trigger rearward, that allows the firing pin to move forward, and it's probably within a second or so of you pulling the trigger backwards.
I have no further questions at this time. Defense counsel may ask questions.
All right, so now we're going to see what the defense is going to do with this witness, because again, I think the what we could say the purpose of this witness is to establish that you would be aware you're pulling that trigger. So therefore, they're establishing that you could not just accidentally pull the trigger. There was no problems with the gun that would cause an accidental discharge. So if it discharges 9 times, it's going to require 9 trigger pulls. So the jury's going to be left to figure out, is it possible that someone could have to pull the trigger 9 times, and with awareness of doing that, be in fear all 9 times and think, hey, this is reasonable that I'm shooting this guy 9 times who's unarmed, who's maybe a professional fighter. Could I have shot it in the sky? Could I have shot it, there's numerous different things he could have done possibly. Or even once he says, all right, I've shot it once, do you stop? Well, we're going to see here. Let's see the direction, what direction the defense goes here.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Sorry, I just want to take you through a couple of questions about the lab first, and then we'll get into your testing.
Yes.
I believe you already testified that this is how you received this particular item at the lab.
Yes.
And you received a magazine as well, correct?
Yes, there was a second package that contained the magazine and some live cartridges.
Okay. How many live cartridges do you recall?
There were 4.
Okay. Is that documented in your report?
Yes.
I'm going to show you a document. And I believe that there are a number of documents that get generated as a result of your examination, correct?
Yes, there are.
I'm just going to briefly ask you, are you familiar with what's called an evidence examination request?
Yes.
If I showed you an evidence examination request, would you be able to identify it?
Yes, I can check to see if the case number is what I have here in front of
And
me.
that's my next question. Are these items and are these examinations and tests identified in a particular way so that you know what case you're working on?
Every case that comes into the laboratory, yes, is designated with a laboratory case number that coincides with whatever the police agency case number is. Thank you.
Does this look like that document?
Yes, it does. The case number that's on here corresponds to what I have in my notes and on my report.
Now, does that document include both the firearms you've identified on the screen as well as the magazine?
It does,
Are
yes.
they labeled in a particular way?
I don't see any difference between that. One is the firearms listed as BML1, and the package with the magazine and the ammunition is BML1B.
Okay. And those are 2 separate packages they came to separately?
That's correct.
Do you recall if the magazine came loaded with ammunition?
If I can consult my notes just to refresh my memory.
Is your memory exhausted?
No,
Do you need to consult your notes to determine how many rounds of ammunition came with the package?
it's not something I've committed to memory, but I do have notes on whether or not the magazine was loaded or if it was unloaded at the time.
Please consult your notes.
Yes, in this particular instance, the magazine was loaded and the 4 live rounds were inside the magazine when I received it.
And you previously testified that you tested that magazine for function, correct?
Correct.
The magazine functioned correctly, yes?
Yes, it did.
And when you use that ammunition to test the function of the firearm, it's fair to say that you use ammunition from the lab and not ammunition that was collected as evidence, correct?
Correct. I use laboratory ammunition unless I absolutely need to use the evidence ammunition.
Okay, so you unloaded the ammunition that came in that magazine and then tested that magazine, correct?
Right.
And then you would have preserved that ammunition as part of the evidence packet, correct?
Correct. Typically, I will place it into a small Ziploc bag and that goes back into the original packaging with the magazine.
You document your findings, correct?
I do, yes.
As a matter of fact, you just referenced in front of the jury that you take notes as a result of this.
I do, yes.
And it's good practice as a forensic examiner to take notes and to write everything down so that in case you have to testify in front of a jury, you have an opportunity to talk about the tests you did, any values or data that you gathered, correct?
Correct.
I want to take you very briefly
through something called a firearm examination worksheet. Do you have that with your notes today?
I do, yes.
So very briefly, I want to take you through your firearm examination worksheet that you filled out. So just so that we're clear, the lab number that you have on your notes, is that L2301755?
That's correct, it is.
Okay. And is that worksheet dated 4/10/23?
It is.
Are those your initials in the top right-hand corner under examiner?
Yes, JRT.
JRT. Okay. And again, the exhibit number that matches the item that you believe you brought in for testing, correct?
I didn't bring it into the laboratory, it was submitted by police personnel, but yes, BML1 is the exhibit on my worksheet.
I guess I should rephrase. When you accepted this item in for testing, is that the correct number?
Yes, it is BML1.
And we've already identified that it came in this box. Is there anything else about the box? Was it sealed? Was it unsealed? Anything like that?
It was sealed with blue and red evidence tape. It was a typical gun box that firearms, handguns are typically submitted to.
And that's the standard, correct?
It is, yes.
And again, based upon your data and your observations, this is a Glock model handgun, correct?
Glock is the make, yes. The specific model for this gun is the Model 17.
And Glock makes a number of models, and you identified this as a Glock Model 17, correct?
I did.
Okay, and that's a caliber 9mm, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Now, the firearm has a serial number, correct?
It does.
And you documented that?
I did.
And that serial number is AFXE105.
That's right.
Now, not all firearms have serial numbers, correct? But this one did.
Most that are imported or created or manufactured in the United States do require to have a serial number on the frame of the firearm, and this one did have a serial number on the frame.
So when a manufacturer creates a frame, right, when they create a firearm that functions, they have to submit certain documentation to the federal government, and that includes the serial number, correct?
What sort of paperwork do manufacturers deal with and how their information is submitted to the federal government is out of my area of expertise. I'm not aware of any of that type of information.
The serial number, is that help in tracing firearms?
I believe it does, yes.
Have you ever done a firearm trace?
No, I've not.
Have you ever seen a firearm trace?
No, I've not.
Now, you listed off a number of coursework, classes, certifications that you've taken as a firearm examiner as part of your career in education. Does any of that education deal specifically with Glock firearms?
One of the courses that I taken a number of years ago was an armorer's course that was put on by Glock individual or folks that work for Glock.
Okay. And have you taken any recent courses that deal with Glock firearms or Glock firearm manufacturing?
No, I've not. I believe the class that I took was probably in 2006, if I remember correctly.
You believe that that was the last time that you took a class on Glocks?
I believe that was the only time I'd taken an armorer's course by Glock, yes.
Okay. You didn't attend a training called Manufacturing Methods of Glock Pistols in 2022?
That was a webinar that was presented by my colleagues in the field on Glock pistols, and I was talking a little bit about, if I remember correctly, about the way that their barrels are manufactured.
Okay. The state brought you through how this particular firearm functions, correct?
Yes.
You talked a lot about the trigger safety, which is and you identified that on the image, and you stated that there are no other buttons or levers or anything else that could be called a safety on this particular firearm, correct?
None on the external surfaces of it. There are two other safety features that are housed inside of the firearm that are not visible from the outside.
And that's the firing pin block and the drop safety, correct?
That's correct, yes.
The drop safety is sometimes called a trigger bar safety, correct?
I don't recall off the top of my head. I just know it as what Glock refers to it as the drop safety.
Okay. And all of these function to make sure that unless somebody pulls the trigger, the gun does not go off.
Correct. Yes. In pulling the trigger on a Glock pistol, that will disengage the trigger safety as well as the two internal ones, the drop safety and the firing pin safety.
You conducted an examination of this particular Glock pistol with this serial number, and you found it to be functioning normally, correct?
That's correct.
You couldn't get it to go off by dropping it or striking it with a mallet or a hammer or anything like that, correct?
That's right. No, it functioned normally as I would expect it to.
And you tested and you recorded the data that this particular firearm has a trigger pull of approximately 7.5 pounds.
7 to 7.5 pounds, yes.
And that's in the normal range for a Glock firearm.
It's typical, yes.
Okay. And you, beyond the fact that the firearm functioned when you tested it, did you disassemble the firearm to check the internal mechanisms of the firearm?
No, I did not.
Okay. But you loaded it with a magazine, you brought it to a testing facility, you pulled the trigger, and it functioned properly, correct?
Yes, when I test fired it the 3 times, I found that it operated without any type of malfunction.
And again, you couldn't get it to malfunction by striking it, dropping it, or conducting any other tests like that, correct?
Right, during that jar-off testing that I mentioned, where I use basically a 3-pound rubber mallet to strike the firearm in a number of places to see if that action can cause the firing pin to move forward, I found that it didn't fire whenever it was struck, so it passed that jar-off test.
So once an individual were to place a loaded magazine into this particular Glock firearm and pull back that slide, for lack of a better term, to make it ready to shoot, they need nothing else but pull the trigger, correct?
That's correct.
So other manipulations of the item need to be made in order to fire it, correct?
Right, once a round has been chambered, meaning that, like you said, that slide moves forward, takes a live round of ammunition from the magazine and puts it into the chamber. At that point, the person can pull the trigger, which disengages those 3 safeties and the gun could fire.
It's designed to work that way?
Yes.
It's a popular firearm, correct?
As far as I know, yes.
Glock firearms are used by police officers.
I know that they are duty weapons for a number of
Is
agencies.
the Glock firearm something you can go down to a licensed federal dealer and buy as a civilian?
I would imagine so, yes.
Just a brief note with regards to the flashlight. Other than it being a flashlight or a laser, I think you described it as, does it modify or change the function of the item of the firearm and handgun?
No, I don't believe it does. In fact, when I go to test fire, I typically take those off of the front end of the firearm, so it'll fit into the port of the shoot tank that I fire into.
Now, you described for the state at length the difference between a semi-automatic firearm, a revolver, potentially a rifle, or a long gun, a handgun. Are there handguns that operate in different ways than a Glock handgun?
If you're talking about, do you mean like the type of operating system that each uses, for example?
I'll use language I think you're probably familiar with. The Glock firearm is considered a striker firearm, correct?
That's correct.
There's no
Yes.
external hammer on a Glock firearm, correct?
That's right.
So there's no hammer that a person could potentially pull back with their thumb or anything like that.
Right. The firing pin of the striker is housed inside of the slide.
Now, there are in fact semi-automatic firearms that do have a hammer that can either be pulled back or operated by pulling the trigger, correct?
That's right. Yes, there are.
And those would have heavier or lighter trigger pulls based upon the design of those firearms, correct?
That's true. Yes, depending on how those firearms operate, there could be a variety of trigger pull weights for depending on how the firearm operates.
And you would agree then that there are other handguns, there are other pistols that operate similarly to a Glock, but have different features such as a hammer or an external safety or thing of that nature, correct?
Yes, there are a variety of semi-automatic pistols that might operate a little bit differently, but and have different features that make the gun function.
As the state had you testify to on direct, this firearm
You pull the trigger, it operates itself, correct? And it reloads for the next shot.
It does, as long as there's ammunition in the magazine.
And that's semi-automatic. That's the definition of semi-automatic.
Correct, that each pull of the trigger will fire the gun.
And you were particular about this, which is that the weapon will operate either until it runs out of ammunition or the person stops, correct?
Correct. With magazine, if there's ammunition in it and you fire, you continue to fire by pulling the trigger. Yes, either you stop shooting or if you run out of cartridges. Yes.
Okay. And bringing you back, this item came to the lab with a magazine that was submitted with it, correct?
Yes, it was packaged separately.
Now that magazine came in with the same incident number and the same lab number, correct?
That's right.
And that would lead you to believe that it was an item that was submitted or seized with this firearm, correct?
I wasn't there to collect it. I don't go to scenes or anything like that, but the fact that it's the same case number, the submission numbers are similar in that one item is BNL1 and then the package with the ammunition is BNL1B.
And do you recall, or can you describe for us, were there any markings on that magazine?
There's manufacturing information that's stamped on there, yes.
Okay. And do you recall with regards to this particular item that you examined, whether or not there was manufacturing information?
On the magazine, there was the make Glock as well as the Glock logo, what caliber it was, and then a series of numbers. I'm not quite sure what they were, but I know that they were on the magazine.
And it's fair to say that the magazine being marked Glock and this being a Glock firearm, that they're manufactured by the same company.
I don't know if the magazines are also made in Austria. I don't know the background of where the particular magazines are, but they're marked for Glock, and the magazine that I received was compatible with this Glock pistol.
Okay. Do you recall what the magazine capacity was of this particular magazine?
I do. It was marked 17.
Okay. And you recall that there were 4 live 9mm cartridges in that magazine when it was submitted to you?
That's correct.
Okay. And you said the capacity is 17?
Yes.
And so essentially the magazine came to you. I just want to be clear because I'm not sure that I heard you say this. The magazine was loaded when you received it?
Yes.
And you had to unload it?
Correct. It was packaged inside of a small manila envelope, and the magazine in there did have 4 cartridges that were in it. So when I conduct my examination, I take those live rounds out of the magazine.
As is the typical practice at your forensic laboratory, was this submitted to you? Did you check it out of an evidence room? Could you walk us through that procedure?
Yes, typically when the items are submitted to the laboratory, they are brought to the front desk of the laboratory, which is called evidence control. At that point, it's typically brought in by police personnel. The folks that work at the evidence control area will then check the items in, and through our computer system, a set of barcode stickers is created that contains the laboratory case number as well as the police agency case number, the item number or exhibit number, so in this case BML1 and BML1B, and then a barcode. And that barcode is basically what tracks the item as it makes its way through the laboratory. So it was brought into the laboratory, and it was checked in by the evidence control personnel, and then put into a storage area in the evidence control area. So when I'm ready to work the case, I will then request from the evidence control personnel the items related to this. So in this case, it was the gun and magazine. They let me know when they've retrieved it from storage. I will go up to the front counter, and they will transfer those items to me, and that transaction is recorded in the computer system through scanning the barcode items, as well as myself and the other person putting in PIN numbers to make that exchange. So once I've done that, then I take the firearm to my work area, and then I begin my examination. So at that point, it's in my custody.
And once it's in your custody and once you take it to your examination area, you take care to document anything you're examining, correct?
Correct, yes.
And so you would have noted, again, all the data that we already talked about, the model number, the manufacturer, the capacity of the magazine, all of those things are important, correct?
Yes, all of that information about the gun is what I document in
Including the
the
fact that it came to you loaded, correct?
The gun itself wasn't loaded.
I apologize, the magazine came to you loaded.
The magazine did have ammunition in it, but at that point, the magazine and the firearm are separate, so packaged separately, and there's no issue of like a loaded gun or anything like that coming in.
Understood, and that's why they're separated, essentially, to keep them safe. But again, my question to you was that magazine was loaded as it came to you, correct? And you documented all that information.
Yes, it was.
I have no further questions, Mr. Minister.
Thank you.
So this is a good time to break. So we will break for the day. We will resume tomorrow at 10 o'clock. So remember, don't watch news, don't listen to radio, don't read the paper.
All right, guys. So that is the 2 witnesses on there. Now, that was, like I said, that was a stronger witness than I thought as far as why they brought her on, because they wanted her to testify essentially and get it right in the jury's mind right away, right from the onset, that it requires 9 trigger pulls. Now, the defense did a good job because they got her to talk about the fact that it's, at the end of the day, it's semi-automatic. You're not having to go through you're not having to disengage the safety. You're not having to do a whole lot of stuff. You're not having to chamber a bullet or anything like that. Because it's semi-automatic, when you pull the trigger, it's automatically going to get you ready to fire another round. So then it's just a matter of pulling the trigger again and pulling the trigger again. So it's not quite, it doesn't require the awareness that, say, a revolver would, or a gun that isn't considered semi-automatic, where you'd have to chamber another bullet and go back and do it again, because it's doing that process for you once you fire that first shot. So again, I think it's a bigger win for the state here, in my opinion, from the standpoint of showing that, look, he's firing 9 shots, and when you count out 9 shots, 1 shot, 2 shot, 3 shot, 4 shot, 5 shot, 6 shot, 7 shot, 8 shot, 9 shot. I mean, by the 9th shot, I'm aware of what I'm doing. But again, in that moment with the adrenaline flowing, you've got 3 people around you that you think are coming to attack you. You've been punched. You've got one guy's got pepper spray. just kind of firing for your life, I guess, in the way the defense will be arguing here. So we'll see what happens. It's going to be interesting. But this is going to be a very, very interesting case. This is the type of case I like to cover. This is the type of case that I like to talk about because these are the cases that come down to understanding the law and understanding what the law says is a crime or says isn't a crime. And this is where good attorneys can make a huge difference. So this is going to be an interesting one. This is going to be a very, very interesting one. So we're going to be covering this all week long. I'm going to be coming in, trying to put together daily recaps. Obviously, I'm not going to be sitting here going 8 hours deep on these. I'm going to try to bring the relevant information and talk about what I think is relevant and how I think the state's case is going. I will be watching each and every single day because as a 13th juror, and we all should be, I would encourage you as well to watch on Law and Crime and consider, watching this on a daily basis. But like I said, I'm going to bring you the highlights. I'm going to bring you the relevant information. But in order for you to effectively be able to figure out what your feeling is, give this case a watch, guys. It's on Law and Crime. I think there's another station that's also covering it that I think is a local Boston news station. So it's out there, but I'll be bringing you the coverage here. I'll be going over what's going on, and we will be following this case to its fruition, and we'll see what happens. Remember, justice is a process, so we want to see a fair process, and so far, I am impressed. I'm impressed with the judge. I'm impressed with the prosecutor. She seems very honest. She seems very straightforward, and she's putting forward a good case. And the defense seems to be pretty competent as well. And this is going to be a great case, I think. I'm looking forward to covering it. So anyways, guys, put in the comments what you think about day one. Who do you think won today? Prosecution, defense. What do you think the outcome is going to be? Do you think this guy has a chance? Or do you think, like I do, that video in that alleyway is going to be the toughest hurdle for him to overcome? Let me know what you think, guys. And remember, justice works better when watched. It's just a fact, guys. So in the meantime, until we talk again, let justice prevail, guys, and I will be talking to you soon.